everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to talk about glazing yarn versus overdying yarn and what the difference there really is. Overdying yarn is typically when you have yarn that already has a color on it and then you add another layer of color to that. This could be over a commercially dyed yarn, or it could be over a layer of color that you've already added yourself. Glazing can be a type of overdying because you can glaze over color that is already there. However, sometimes I will also glaze yarn over white where it is the dyeing technique and not just an overdying thing. Glazing specifically refers to a technique where you have high acid such that the dyes are going to strike to the yarn so fast you get an effect that feels almost airbrushed. Like you can see through the layer of dye to what colors were there before. And so you might feel like you have a navy on top of a green versus having a teal, even though the average is a little bit of a teal, if that makes sense. And so the plan today is a simple one. I want to dye some yarn a base color of a yellow, and then we're gonna overdye it in two different ways with the same color. We'll use a pink. We will overdye it in a way that should get all over color. We'll do things that'll let the color sort of penetrate those fibers more. And then we'll try to glaze with this pink color. The one asterisk that I have here is that I don't think I've ever intentionally glazed yarn with the pink I'm planning to use today, Deep Magenta. I know that it is a good candidate for glazing. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I'm just excited to see how it turns out. And if it doesn't give us a good example of what I'm trying to illustrate, I'll share this video anyway and we'll give it another go another time. Today, we are gonna be dyeing Knit Picks Hawthorne Fingering Weight yarn. This yarn is 80% superwash fine Highland wool, 20% polyamide, which is a nylon. And I picked this yarn specifically because it is high twist. It is a 2-ply yarn. Each ply is a little bit thicker than say on like a stroll or something that is 4-ply but still fingering weight. And having the slightly thicker plies means that there's more fibers on the interior part of the yarn and it's a little bit easier to see that glaze. But now I'll go ahead and add some removable nylon zip ties to the yarn, and then I'm going to go ahead and pre-soak all of this yarn for at least 30 minutes just so it can be well saturated. Some yarns you may want to pre-soak for longer. There's certainly no harm in doing an overnight pre-soak. I'm not going to add any acid to the pre-soak. It'll just be plain tap water, but I know that this yarn is pretty absorbent, and so therefore it does not need as long as a pre-soak as say a cotton yarn or a silk blend or something like that. Today my plan is to use 2 colors and we're going to keep things simple. For a base layer, we're going to dye all 4 skeins probably at the same time with some brilliant yellow acid dye from Dharma. And then when we're done with that, our glaze is going to be Dharma's Deep Magenta. Now, these are both stock solutions that I made a while ago, but there is a difference between them. Our brilliant yellow is mixed at a 1% stock solution strength, and the Deep Magenta is mixed at a 0.5% stock solution strength. So this means we have here 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of liquid, and over here we have a ½ gram of dye per 100 milliliters of liquid. You can mix your stock solutions at whatever concentration you want. Again, with a little asterisk, like I think making a 6% stock solution would be really hard because there's a solubility of the dyes that you have to take into account. But I could have made a 0.05% stock solution. You're just going to need to use a larger volume of it to get similar amounts of dye. But I'm really excited because I think that we're going to get some awesome glazing results with this Deep Magenta. Because I've been thinking it's a great candidate for glazing for a long time and just haven't tried to do it intentionally. How do I know that Deep Magenta is going to be a good candidate for glazing? I have observed that it'll strike to yarn really quickly, even with low acid. And the place where this experiment could fail is that in our overdyed, not glazed yarn, we could still see some glazing in there because of how quickly this color can bind. So if you have a dye color that you know will bind really quickly, then it's a great candidate for glazing. If you have one like an emerald green, our brilliant yellow here, Caribbean blue, colors that take longer to bind to yarn, fluorescent fuchsia is another one that takes a long time to bind, and colors that tend to spread more, those are not good candidates for glazing because we want the color to bind to the yarn as soon as it comes into contact and not have time to sort of penetrate the fibers more. I have a whole glazing yarn playlist that you can go check out if you want to see some other colors that glaze well and the conditions that I used to achieve those results. My tap water does start as slightly acidic, so take that into account. And I suppose the other thing is that it would probably be easier for me to switch to citric acid because I use so much vinegar, and volume per volume, citric acid is more potent, but also ultimately a bit cheaper than vinegar. So doing that transition could make sense someday, but if it ain't broke, why fix it? And a lot of times it's easier for people who are wanting to dye yarn at home, it's easier for them to find vinegar. So that's what I use. Enough talking, let's go dye our yarn. In 24 cups of water, I'm gonna add a half cup or approximately 120 milliliters of our 1% stock of brilliant yellow. And so that would be approximately 1.2 grams of dye total. Eek! I squeezed out most of the water from the yarn, but it's still dripping. We don't have any acid in here yet, so the color should spread pretty far. The yellow can strike fast sometimes, but by starting with no acid, we should be able to get good coverage all over the yarn. And if you're thinking ahead, this is the kind of thing that I'm planning to do when we want to overdye this in the next layer with the pink. Now, I could remove the yarn. If I wanted more semi-solid, even coverage, I should remove the yarn before I do this, but it doesn't really matter. I'm gonna add 2, 3, 4, 5, heaping 6 tablespoons of white vinegar, and we'll mix this by raising and lowering the yarn. The reason why you would want to remove the yarn if you wanted the color more even is if you remove the yarn and stir it, the acid is more distributed throughout. And with the acid being more concentrated on part of the yarn, then the colors could strike faster there as well. But with a tonal yellow, it's hard to get a lot of contrast anyway. And we have really good coverage. All right. I am going to take this to the stove and I'm going to heat it until the color has all absorbed. Normally I like to heat yarn for 30 minutes. I think I will set it up in a way that it will get that 30 minutes today by just setting a timer for an hour. I know that starting cold, it takes about 30 minutes to heat up. And then if I wanted to wait 30 minutes, I'd wait another 30. But since I'm going to be dyeing all the yarn again, it doesn't really matter how long it heats as long as all the color's in the yarn. But this just makes sense for what's going on in my house today. So I'll see you in about an hour when it's time to remove the yarn from the dye bath. It's been an hour. I covered it because I had the lid handy, not because you need to cover it. I'm gonna turn off the heat and gonna raise up the zip ties and let them cool a little bit. It is okay that I'm using pink zip ties. I'm not worried about any color transfer because we're gonna overdye this with pink anyway. But let's check. The water is clear. It is very hot. I'm gonna go ahead and leave the yarn in the pot because the extra heat isn't gonna harm anything. And just, again, that is what is convenient for me today. And tomorrow, I have to think, it's possible I'll decide to rinse 2 of the skeins that we're gonna overdye versus glaze, but that's tomorrow Rebecca's problem. And I'll see you in the morning. And again, I'm waiting till tomorrow for convenience. Otherwise, we could do the next step right now. It is officially the next morning. And as you can see, I let the yarn chill in the dye bath overnight. Now, my plan is to randomly take 2 of these skeins, and I was gonna remove even more water, but I realized I'm gonna be glazing these ones, so it's actually okay if I have some water left in here. because having water in the yarn is going to limit the ability of the dye to go into it. But the big thing I wanted to do is label the zip ties with a Sharpie, because on the off chance that the experiment doesn't give us a significant difference, I want to know that these two were the two that I glazed, and they just have a dot on the zip ties. Now this dye bath started again with 24 cups of water and 6 tablespoons of white vinegar. But I am coming with the other 2 skeins, the skeins that will just do overdying, where I'm going to be using a whole new dye bath for that. I'm going to squeeze out a lot of the water, and I'm actually going to rinse the yarn a little bit. I am adding this yarn into just some plain water to dilute the acid that is in there. And that is because I want, with the second batch, I'm going to want the colors to strike really slow. But for now, I'm going to set this aside so we can set up our glazed yarn. Because this time our dye bath is completely room temperature, I can reuse it for the glaze. And we already have some acid in there. I'm going to add 300 more milliliters of white vinegar into here. I'm going to grab some gloves and safety glasses. And I am unsure with how much dye I should really use. I do want to shake up that Deep Magenta dye really well. I was debating using 50 milliliters, but I think, because we can always add more dye, I'm going to go with 30 milliliters of our Deep Magenta dye. And I just realized that now that there's a little bit of acid in here, it'll be okay. I'll rinse this out. The only reason why I realized and cared about that is because I want to, as close to as I can, measure out and set aside the 30 milliliters of dye that we're going to use for our other yarn, just so that way the amount that I've shaken the bottle is the same for both. We're trying to keep things as similar as possible. Okay, now I did not stir. Where are my tongs? I always know that it seems counterintuitive to do the glazed layer cold. And I could increase the volume of water more, but I'm not going to do that today. The reason why I start with things cold as I add our yarn in, lift it up once and put it back down, is that this allows me to get coverage all over our yarn. Because the dye did not strike super fast, and I'm going to go take this and start heating this up for about an hour, because that's how long it should take everything to heat up, and then gives us 30 minutes of heat. But the combination of cold and high volume of water means that it's going to take longer for the dye molecules to reach the yarn. But then the high acid is going to make it so that way as soon as the dye comes into contact with the yarn, it's more likely to strike, and strike quickly. In this case, we want the opposite. I have 24 cups of water here, no acid. My tap water is slightly acidic, so that can be a factor and can cause colors to bind a little bit faster. But I am encouraged by how slowly I saw things did not strike in the other pot, so I'm much more confident that we can work these colors through more. And again, it probably would be better for me to do this project with colors and exact conditions that I know work well for glazing. I've hypothesized that Deep Magenta will glaze, so I suppose that's another question we have going on at the same time. Okay, so this time I'm grabbing our yarn. I took this yarn that I soaked in water, and I'm squeezing out as much of the water as I can. Because when I come and bring the water in, I'm going to start very similarly in that, like, I'm bringing the water in, I'm moving it around, but I'm going to want the yarn to really soak up the color. And we're going to stir it more in a moment. I just want to Get rid of this liquid. But rather than doing just like a 1-2 dunk, where I put it in, raise it up, put it in, I really want to stir because I want that pink to get inside the yarn. And you know, our results could be really, really subtle. The good news is that we still have a lot of pink here. And we could see some glaze in here, but you know, we're doing our best. And the movement and the low acid is helping more of this color get into like our yarn. And so now what I want to do, and I'm going to just do this by lifting the yarn out, but I'm going to start with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. And then we're going to add the yarn in and move it around. And it's okay if things aren't completely even, but the goal is to really distribute the color over the yarn. And you know, I think that we could end up with a situation where I'm going to wish I had more dye. I reduced it more because I was thinking, gee, I should have looked up at the proportions of Pink Orchid, but Deep Magenta is so intense that it is what it is, okay? So let's add 2 more. And most of the color is in the yarn at this stage. Now, if I'm doing an overdyed layer for a layered tonal, I don't always move things this much. I'm just trying to get as much difference between the 2 versions of this colorway as I can. And this orange color, this like light yellow orange color, is so pretty that I really like it. I'm just, you know, it is what it is. Not everything goes according to plan. Not every demonstration works the way I think it will. As I like come over and I'm like, please work. Please, please, please work. Is what it is. You know, sometimes things don't work perfectly and then we'll just try it again. But I'm gonna go start heating this one too. I technically haven't set a timer yet. That's not a big deal, but almost all the color is in our yarn. And I don't think I see glazing. I think I see some really pretty tonal variation, but I'm nervous that we won't see much of a difference. But again, is what it is. I'll see you in about an hour when things heat up. Here is our overdyed but not glazed yarn, and you can see the water is sort of like that pale pink. I just brought it over to the heat, and I want to show this in contrast with where our glazed attempt is. I don't know how well this is showing up on camera, but like over here you can see there is still a lot more dye in the water, and I think up here it does definitely look more, I see more yellow than what I saw in our other container. And so don't forget that this container has more acid in it. 300 milliliters of vinegar is, gosh, is that 20 tablespoons? That might be about 20 tablespoons because 1 tablespoon of white vinegar is 15 milliliters. So 15 times 6 would be 90. Plus this one already had that 90 milliliters and then I added 300 more. And so I'm going through all this to be like, there's probably 4 times as much vinegar in here as there is in the other container, which, you know, in theory would mean that the colors could strike faster. But we're heating things up and we're really just, that movement, moving and stirring the yarn, brings the yarn in contact with more of the dye. And here we're waiting for things to warm up so that way we get more diffusion. And the diffusion will bring more of the dye in contact with the yarn. And you see a lot more of that diffusion and movement once you start adding heat and you see more spread. And that's something that we see all the time. So I'm very, very excited. And this gives me hope that the project is gonna work. But that's the thing with experiments. Like I try to show something that I know to be true, but sometimes things don't work out the way I expect. And I still have to share that anyway, because then we can figure out what to do differently and how to vary conditions. Like the 2 things we varied here were really the amount of acid and then how much we moved the yarn when we put it in the pot. One of them is easy to measure, the other one isn't, but I still think it's fun. I'll see you in an hour. It's been an hour. And we're coming first to our just overdyed yarn because I figured let's look at this guy first. I'm like checking for glaze. I mean, it's such a pretty color. Oh my gosh, it's a beautiful orange. It's feeling like, you know, we've got tonal variation in here. There's more yellow and less yellow areas. But there isn't something that I look and I go, ooh, it's glazed. We might see that when it dries, but that's a TBD. Our glazed attempt. It is such a happy color. Oh man, I just turned off the heat like 30 seconds ago, and so that's why these zip ties sunk down. And sometimes once you get them out of the water, you can just wait a minute so then you can comfortably hold it and oh man, guys, I see some glaze. It's super subtle. Let's see if we see more down here. Yep, I see some glaze down here. So what's funny is that our coverage is way patchier, which you would expect. I don't think it's gonna read on camera right now. It's too steamy to focus. But I feel some of that airbrushedness down here, like right there. Yeah, as I try to like zoom in on camera, the camera's like, what do you want me to focus on? I am too steamy, I can't do it. Oh man. So we'll have to wait for it to dry. Certainly even zoomed out, you can see that, ooh, we have some yellow here that didn't get dyed. You can tell that our color is more even over here than it is over here. So we do have those differences. But ooh, like right here, it's like a perfect example of glaze. Like you can open it up and see the different colors in there. Maybe I can zoom in on my hand. Might be too close, but it's like when it almost looks like the halo on the yarn picks up the color. So it's not as dramatic of a glaze as I saw, but we're doing a bright on a bright, but I do see more glazing here than I do there. I need to redo this sometime with using more dye, but we do have a difference for sure, and so that makes me happy. But now I'm gonna go set aside all of this yarn to cool completely, and then we can wash it. Orange can be such a hard color to read. I wonder if the color balance is off, but you see that airbrush quality, how it's almost like you see the more gold color underneath that little layer of pink. That is our glaze. And it's a feeling that we don't really have over here. Over here, even with the tonal variation, things feel more consistent. I'd still love to redo this side by side. It's fun to use yellow because it is a color that you can get high contrast with later on. And so therefore I think that that's like good for pink. A bright blue could work really well under a pink too. But maybe next time we'll do it using, say, navy over the yellow. I mean, didn't I think that there's like a bright blue, like brilliant blue from Jacquard is probably really good at glazing. And so that is a combination that would be super fun as I'm using up the dregs of this bottle of dish soap. I'm just brainstorming here. But I think that the next time I do this, I'm gonna try to go for something that would be a little more dramatic. And so therefore using a dark color versus a bright color for our glaze attempt would be worthwhile. But I feel the airbrush on the yarn that is closer to my wrist. And the difference was the amount of acid and how much we moved things. Oh man. And so one thing that is worth thinking about is the little things that you do that can make a difference in the way your colors go. And so I recommend keeping a diary, a lab notebook, keeping track of your dyeing projects, because while there's a lot of things you can do by feel, sometimes little differences in the volume and the pH don't make a difference. Other times they can make a bigger difference. And so both of these colorways are things that I feel like I could get some really good consistency with. I think I would be able to reproducibly dye pretty much either one, which is a really good feeling to have, I will be honest. But there are times when I've done something that I thought should be reproducible, and it wasn't, because of the subtle differences that maybe are harder to measure, like the heat and how many times I've used that dye bath and things like that. So it's worth keeping some kind of record for yourself. For me, it's handy. I'm making these videos, and so then I could go back and watch them, and I write down notes as I edit. And so sometimes if I'm not sure, then I have the video to refer back to. And so that's super helpful. But anyway, I'm gonna go put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry so we can take a closer look. Here we have our yarn. We have our glazed yarn, and then the yarn we overdyed with a more even layer. And right now you can really feel the difference. The difference between getting a more even layer of color over on the left and getting a less even layer of color on the right. And you really feel not quite the bright yellow that we had at the beginning, but you feel like you have this golden yellow color underneath something that is more orange with our glazed yarn right here. And yes, that is because we do have some areas that are more yellow that have a little bit less of the glaze. Part of applying the color, it's not going to be even, and it's more dramatic. And when you can see how uneven it is when you have a tonal semi-solid base to start with. But I mean, this is a tonal yarn. There's tonal variation in here. It's just a little more dramatic here. And you know, in here you can feel the like different hues of orange with our more solid yarn. But then when I move over to our more glazed yarn, you really feel that like airbrushedness in it. And just around here, it's almost like the halo that is on the yarn, the little bit of the ends of the yarn that are sticking out into solution grabbed up the color, leaving more of that original color that we saw there. Could the differences be even more dramatic if I had added more pink dye? Absolutely. And so we'll play around with that more in the future. But even if you're not getting a glaze, by having more acid and getting more tonal variation in your yarn, you can end up with yarns that have the exact same amount of dye on them, but then have a character to them that makes them feel different. I love twisting the yarn up because I think it really then starts to highlight some of the tonal variation within the yarn. Maybe because you're seeing more different areas of the skein next to itself. I don't know, but something about it really makes glazing pop. I mean, you can just see that light layer. Maybe it's holding the strands taut. I don't know. It just feels more present and obvious now than it did before. And then in our other skein, you can see the more pink and the more yellow sections, but you don't feel that airbrush. And again, the two variables we really mixed up here were having a lot more acid and moving the yarn a lot more. And so you can get a pretty dramatic difference. I would say these two yarns have a very different character to one another. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I am so relieved that this demonstration worked the way I wanted it to. And I say that because I go into a demonstration, which really we could also call an experiment, and I come in with a hypothesis that if I do this technique this way, I'll get these different results. And the thing about being a scientist is sometimes you know the result, or you have that expected result and you expect it to match your hypothesis. But other times things may not work out as you expected, and then you have to troubleshoot and think about what other variables and things you hadn't considered. And probably one of the riskiest variables for me today was glazing with a dye I had not yet glazed with, at least not intentionally. And so I went for it and took the risk, but it could have not worked, and then we likely would have still seen differences between the colorways, and then would have devised a way to tweak it and modify it in the future. And so that's the fun thing about playing around and trying different techniques. And I love showing things side by side, especially when sometimes it doesn't make a difference and there's a conclusion in there as well. Now, I don't always do all the different controls one should do if I was doing an actual scientific study. But I do love bringing my science background into my projects here. If you didn't know, I started ChemKnits as like a lab notebook to keep track of my knitting and other fiber arts journeys back when I was in graduate school. And I do have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular pharmacology. But I think that the keeping track of all of my projects with that lab notebook, that's probably the biggest way that my science training comes into my artistry. But anyway, that's a little bit of my origin story. And if you love the journey and coming along for the ride, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. And if you love the yarn I dye, there is a really big special mystery surprise way you can support things right now. You can pre-order the 2025 ChemKnits Hanukkah sampler. This sampler will come with 9 wrapped mini skeins, 8 that are 10 grams, 1 that is 20 grams, that will be dyed in the 8 nights of Hanukkah. And each night there will be a different yarn dyeing video featuring different types of techniques and colorways. And so not only do you get the yarn, but there's the videos that everyone can enjoy. And there's a lot of fun extras. I put a lot of thought into how I'm going to wrap the yarn and package things. The whole thing is so much fun and I love putting it together. I will have the sampler itself linked down in the video description. And thank you for taking the time to check it out. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.